piece of Paul. That usually would be a follow.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. So nice to have a full house. I'm honored to be here on the stage with Professor Jill Lepore. She is the David Woods Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard University, and as I know, all of you know, a staff writer at The New Yorker. Her many books include These Truths, New York Times bestseller, and Book of Ages, The Life and Opinions of James Franklin, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. We'll discuss those books and others this evening, as well as her newest volume, If, Then, How the Simlatics Corporation Invented the Future, which is just out in paperback. When I mentioned to the audience who was here last week that Jill would be here tonight, Louis Menand was the person on the stage, and he quipped, well, you'll need a rope line if Jill is going to be here. So we have to fill the room. We filled the room with Louis Menand too, which is very nice. I wanted to actually thank this evening's matchmaker, Bill Beckling, who is an Olympic medal winning rower who now coaches the freshman crew team at Cambridge Ringe and Latin, and he's coached all three of Jill's sons. So, Bill, you brought us Olympic gold tonight. And we thank you for waiving your normal speaker fee. So we had a star-studded lineup this September featuring, in addition to Louis Menand, Jacqueline Jones, who's the current president of the American Historical Association. And next week, Annette Gordon-Reed will be here. All of this is being done in conjunction with the opening of our new permanent galleries as we reintroduce the Concord Museum and launch ourselves into the 21st century. And Jill and I just had a chance to go through the gallery so she has a sense of what we're doing here. I would like, this is complimenting ourselves, but I would like to think it's in the spirit of your work in These Truths, what we're trying to do in our galleries as well. I want to thank our forum producer, Allison Schilling. When we write up these forum descriptions, often months or weeks before I've had the chance to think about my questions, we euphemistically use the wording, join us for a wide-ranging conversation, which is another word perhaps for eclectic, though I hope not disorganized. And what I have in mind is a 30 or 40-minute conversation that will at first paint with a broad brush. Then we might delve into one or two specific topics that Jill has written about. And then I'll ask her a few questions about her newest book that's just out in paperback. Both the newest book, If Then, and These Truths are on sale afterwards, just in one of the classrooms around the corner, and Jill would be happy to sign your copy. So before we turn to These Truths, I really enjoyed this book, The Case for the Nation, which we don't have any copies on sale tonight, but I did get my copy. I don't know where Dawn is in the back, from Dawn today, so she can order you a copy. It's in essence almost a book-length essay about, well, let me tell you what it's about. I'm actually going to quote the introduction of the book. You make the case for the nation and for the enduring importance of the United States and of American civil ideals by arguing against nationalism and for liberalism. So there are a lot of words to unpack there, but perhaps one of the easiest way of doing it is for you to remind, you talk in the book about the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Maybe you could start there.
Sure. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. It's really an honor and delight to be here, and what a treat to see the extraordinary new exhibits. It's really